Well, thank you, and it's good to be back here. I was trying to remember the last time I was here, and I think it was March 2016, and we had a presentation where we had a discussion about a potential risk of war, which at the time sounded implausible, but unfortunately, less than 4 weeks after that, we had the April 4-day war in 2016. And I thought, today we're going to talk about the events that led to the catastrophic war in 2020. And I thought it's probably a good place to start 2016. So in the next half an hour, I'll try to keep it short. We'll try to go through the first sort of serious breach of Russia-centered Armenian security architecture, which happened in 2016. And we'll talk about the so-called Lavrov plan and Russia-Azerbaijan coordination cooperation in the years leading to the 2020 war. Talk about a bit of economics and arms sales and also political changes in Armenia in 2018, and then how the war actually was made possible and the aftermath of it. I know that there will be Q&A, but if you have any questions while I'm talking, do stop me and ask, because probably will be much more entertaining and interesting than talking non-stop. So I think, as I said, I think 2016 is probably the best place to start. And I thought to start this presentation by quoting the Russian first deputy prime minister, the first deputy prime minister, Dmitry Rogozin. On the 11th of April 2016, so the war broke out on the 1st of April, this is on the 11th of April, he gave an interview to one of Russia's top radio stations, Echo Moskvy, which has been shut down a couple of days ago, of course. And this was days after the main military operations had stopped, although the shooting was continuing. So he was asked about his recent trips, 2 trips to the capital of Azerbaijan within a space of 1 month prior to the war. And he was asked if it was correct to say that Russia militarily supports both Azerbaijan and Armenia. And the first deputy PM replied the following: so you understand that Armenia is our ally through the CSTO, which is the Collective Security Treaty Organization. It's like the Russian equivalent of NATO. So he said, do you understand that Armenia is our ally through the CSTO, while Azerbaijan is our strategic partner in the region? We're connected with Azerbaijan by many economic ties. There's a large Azeri diaspora in Russia, and they pay for Russian weapons. It's not the weapons that shoot, it's people who shoot. And I want to say this, there was a lot of horrible agitation, some sort of verbal diarrhea right after my visit to Baku. And to the proposition of the journalist that perhaps Armenians are concerned about those arms transfers from Russia to Azerbaijan, Mr. Rogozin said, the war requires cold-heartedness and not some whimpering, snotty propaganda. In response, reaction to this statement, the Armenian Foreign Ministry said that the language was unacceptable, especially when it was coming from such a high-ranking official. But I brought this episode to show that this unpleasant incident was only one. It was just a show of the deterioration in Armenian-Russian relationship. And it was coming, this statement came against the backdrop of already worsening Armenian diplomatic isolation. Armenia, by the time the 2016 war broke out, was in near total isolation diplomatically. It had reoriented itself completely onto Russia, completely relying on Russia for its pretty much every need, including security. And when Armenian leadership hears a top Russian official saying what he was saying, it was a crisis, in a way, of Armenia's strategy, a security strategy. Ragozin's statement came after the conspicuous silence from Moscow when the war broke out. For 4 days, there was pretty much no reaction, no significant reaction from Moscow. And interestingly, the reaction that came days after the war broke out was from Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, who said that perhaps this war can end when we start discussing with Azerbaijan terms of its accession to Russian-led security bloc, which in Armenia was seen as a suggestion by Russians to Azeris to talk terms over Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and that would have been mutually beneficial for Russia and Azerbaijan. It was also just to highlight how Armenia was isolated. During those days, in early April, Armenia's partners through Eurasian Union were supposed to have a meeting in Yerevan, but they all cancelled their meeting that was scheduled on the 7th of April, not to upset Azeris. At the same time, the Russian Prime Minister traveled to Baku, and they stated that the Russian military supply to Baku will continue. He was trying to get from Russians was to activate the agreements, the security agreements that Armenia had with Russia, and also within the CSTO. The Russian response to Armenia was none, that it's not the CSTO issue, and that there will not really be any Russian involvement. And what was very significant was that the Russian premier travels to Azerbaijan, where they reiterate again that the arms sales will continue. So that was a message to Armenians that whatever deal there was, it was on. But this is all happening in 2016. This is 3 years after Armenia abandoned its association agreement talks with European Union. And it was a watershed moment in a way, because Armenia decided that for the sake of its economic security and as well as physical security, it is best if Armenia abandons European integration and instead chooses the customs union with Russia. As a result of this reorientation, not only Armenia joined the customs union, which then expanded into Eurasia Union, but Armenia also extended the lease for Russian military base until 2044. It agreed to fully take care of all the costs, unlike any other former Soviet country, for example, Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, that they get paid for hosting those bases. Also, Armenia handed over to Russia's Gazprom 100% control over its key energy company, and also agreed that until 2043, Armenia will be exclusively importing oil and gas from Russia. And the last move was to give full control to Russia, Russia's Gazprom, Armenia-Iran gas pipeline. So by April 2016, we're seeing that we're seeing a logical conclusion of the Russia-centered security strategy that was the foundations of which were laid by Levon Petrosyan. Despite the appearances of disagreement between Levon Petrosyan, Robert Kocharyan, Serge Sarkisyan, and the current government, all of them have been pretty much on the same trajectory. What was the decisions that were made in 1990s, meaning to retain the Russian military base, to participate in every single Russian-led organizations, and in general, the Armenian sort of outlook on global affairs that pertains to Armenia, and this is not just Armenia, but diaspora as well. Everything was premised on the following: we have no other choice. Turks are our enemies, so we need to stay as close to Russians as possible. End of it. As a result, it was only logical that Armenia will continue its handing over both economic and security institutions to Russia, and will find itself in diplomatic isolation. Now, there is also by the time when the war started, the Armenian military and also the policymakers understood that things are a lot more serious, so dragging their feet is not working anymore. And the war itself, although we call it a war, but I think there's a consensus now among the military and experts of the conflict that it was reconnaissance operations.
It was what?
It was a reconnaissance operation. So they wanted to test Armenian military strategy. They wanted to test the strengths and weaknesses of the Armenian side. So it's a preparation and a lead up to a new war, a proper one, to a large-scale one. But as I said, these things do not happen overnight. You need to have, if you are preparing an attack, you need to have not only a full military rearmament and preparation, you need to test your enemy's defense lines, which they did in April, but above all, you need to work on the diplomatic front. And I think Azeris had done it brilliantly, pretty much on all fronts. One thing that this conflict has always stood out, it was the fact that unlike any other conflict in former Soviet space, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is the one that received the harshest treatment at its early days by the Soviet government. And if you have been following sort of events in other parts of former Soviet Union, you'd see that when it comes to Transnistria in Moldova, Abkhazia in South Ossetia, and Georgia, you see that there's almost an encouragement from Russia, repeated concern of the rights of these minority groups or regions, autonomous regions. Whereas it was in Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh where the first uprisings were met by pogroms in Sumgait, Baku, and not only Artsakh, but also northeast of Armenia, Tavush region was subjected to the ring operation. I don't know if you're aware about this, but the ring operation that Soviets carried out with Azeris were not only did one of the large-scale ethnic cleansing operations that were done in Getash, north of Artsakh, but they did one also in Tavush, around Voskepar. The reason why I'm recalling this is because there is a clear distinction between all the other conflicts that Russia had been supporting and this one that it had never really supported. What I want to say is that there is, for some reason, a narrative has entered into Armenian politics or Armenian mindset, both in Armenia and in diaspora, that Russia wants Armenia to have Nagorno-Karabakh. And for that reason, we need to stay close because they will ensure that that region will be with Armenia. Apart from sheer propaganda, every single fact about this conflict is pointing to the opposite. Every single interview that you would come across with diplomats from various countries that have been involved in this, from Russians, the sequence of events, it all points that at no stage Russia agreed to the region having a right to self-determination, a referendum, and above all, joining Armenia. This has been a big difference between this conflict and every other conflict. I think we forget that when they started their movement, they didn't say we want to join Russia. Under the Soviet constitution, they could have chosen to become another Transnistria, but they didn't. In fact, they didn't even want to have independence. And moreover, they did vote to join Armenia, and Armenian Soviet Republic did accept them into Armenian Republic. After the Soviet Union collapsed, and when the war was raging, right, it was in fact, I think, Armenian government that came up with the idea of separating them and sort of discarding the events that have happened prior to that and giving them this idea that perhaps pursuing self-determination and referendum is the way forward. And I think it is unfair to turn to them and say that it was you who chose this path, because they didn't. It is also unfair to say that, an entire Armenian nation was fighting for them. We need to look at numbers and statistics. They have given far more people to the war proportionately than Armenia. They have fought they have gone through the ring operations. They know what it felt when they were run by Polyanichko and others. And I think it's just a convenient ploy. And a narrative that comes from the first president's office, Levon Petrosyan's office for sure, because it's, in a nutshell, it's a justification for the failure in diplomatic process, that they failed. And it is also a sort of artificial divide between them and Robert Kocher and Serge Sarkisian, which are pretty much, and the current government, pretty much, they all belong to the same group, or more or less, with slight variations. But their approach and narrative was always one that it is best to align our policies and our approach with what the Russians are saying. Bury the question. Yeah. And not take advantage of all your strengths that you had at a time to solve the conflict on terms that are favorable for you. If you look at how Azeris are behaving, it is the absolute opposite of what Armenians have done. They have tight deadlines and they have very clear demands. And they're doing everything to solidify their gains. Whereas the Armenian side, even 30 years after this event, they're still blaming each other, and that narrative of that Karabakhis do not want to be with Armenia, and you know the other narrative that Karabakhis came to Armenia and they are corrupt and they came to destroy Armenia and so forth, sort of cheap rhetorics. Again, I think it's diversion from the facts. And one of the weaknesses that Armenia has and diaspora is that there is very little knowledge of modern Armenian history. People are not aware how the Karabakh movement came about, who were the leaders, who were the founders, how did it develop, where was the question, was it about independence or was it about a region's unification? How can a movement that is devoted to region's unification all of a sudden abandon it and turn it into something else and try to bury the question? What was actually on the table from 1994 onwards? As details are coming out, you realize that in fact there have been a huge concessions on Armenian side. So I think it's unpredictable history that Armenians are dealing with, and that's why they're disoriented. Has there been any proper explanation as to why Turkey for 4 years or 3 years didn't enter the war? Has there been any explanation? What was the relationship or between between Armenia and Turkey? I think it was very narrowly defined how they want to go about this. And as I said initially, it was about maybe a union state or maybe reinstating of the autonomy. As things were developing, we already had a Kosovo precedent. So what you're talking about is Armenia basically saying, well, we're looking into Kosovo scenario, but then your strategic shift or your initial decision to stick with Russia meant that you cannot talk about it, even though it is harming your national interests. So you didn't talk about it. You didn't dare to talk about it, and you didn't dare to recognize Kosovo. Your narrative was one that we need to align with in Balkans with one kind of people because it goes back to Haiduks of 19th century. And you chose to not take advantage of fascinating case which completely applies to Arta. Again, I want to say that this is done by the Armenian establishment. It doesn't matter whether it's the first, second, or third president. And the diaspora and diasporan organizations have all been on the same page. Absolutely. So, and this is simply because everything is premised on the most simplistic assumption that we have no other choice. We need to stay with Russia no matter what. They're set enemies. In fact, everyone else is pretty much Armenian enemies, and what's more dangerous is that despair and mistrust in anything that has to do with international law, international norms, and any process that involves countries other than Russia, namely the West. The biggest, and I think that it's sort of institutionally from this is coming from early 1990s, from Levon Petrosyan's first presidency even, where we, Armenia, from the beginning, showed no strategic interest or approach in any type of discussions or talks with the West. This might sound a bit strange, but because diaspora is pretty much in the West, but this is nothing to do with state-to-state relationship. This is nothing to do with executive to executive relationship. Sure, the communities can go and protest, but they are citizens of those countries. They have an area of interest and they put pressure on the legislative. It's nothing to do with executive. In fact, you don't really have sort of state lobbying in the US, for example. It's community, it's grassroots organizations, and they have their own worldview. So Armenian state, from early on, pretty much outsourced one of the key elements of its foreign policy to community organizations. Moreover, you'd hear very often that they're upset, and they would point out to millions that, for example, Azerbaijani have used. When a country is investing, and I'm talking only about legal investment, not illegal one, is investing in PR agencies, events, any effort to shape an opinion, it shows that they do care, and they have an agenda, and they have a narrative to push through. The fact that Armenian government has never done it speaks volumes, that it from early on, it chose not to act as a state. It was not about statehood, it was about a territorial dispute that they took to the former sponsor or patron, or whatever you want to call it. But the conflict as that, the hot conflict, was prevented for a while, for about 30 years, for several reasons. First of all, it was the overall geopolitical balance. Russia is, in the first decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was quite weak. And this is when Armenians managed to make most of the progress militarily. After that, Russia was much more interested, especially the first presidency of Putin was all about Russia's integration, especially economic integration with the West. He was one of the biggest champions of that. So there was a status quo in the region. But above all, there was a decision by the OSCE, so that's the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. It's an umbrella organization for Minsk Group that was overseeing the peace talks. They had an embargo of large-scale arms sales to the parties to the conflict. And this is why the West was refraining from large arms supplies to Armenia and Azerbaijan. This conflict is also interesting globally because it's one of those rare ones that it had no peacekeeping operations. Unlike most conflicts in the world where you have some sort of peacekeeping operation, this one was unique because it was resting on the balance of power, as a balance of military capabilities. And that's why it was so critical not to disturb this balance. And it lasted until 2009-10. So this is when we see the first signs that things are not going to go well for Armenia. And I'm bringing all these elements because the war happened in 2020, and another false narrative that was floating around was that, Armenia angered Russians, worked with Soros. Soros brought all these changes, and as a result, we were punished. And it's the most convenient explanation of a very large-scale war happening sort of overnight, and for some reason that Soros never came to rescue Armenians. But it was something very simplistic that, this is what you need in case of propaganda. You need something very simplistic that you throw into you throw to masses. But the shift, the real sort of shift in the conflict dynamic is happening after the Georgian War in 2008. So when the Russia-Georgia War happens, this is when we see that Russia is sort of reorienting itself to consolidate its power over former Soviet states, and that's when it starts using this conflict to achieve that objective. How do you actually control the Karabakh conflict? You need to have your boots on the ground. But there was a problem with this because Russia was one of the 3 co-chairs of Minsk Group, and all the discussions and proposals under the Minsk Group, they all said that any peacekeeping operation will exclude the members, peacekeepers from the co-chair countries, meaning they will not be Americans, French, or Russians. Moreover, it also said that military from neighboring countries cannot be part of this peacekeeping, meaning there was no opportunity for Turks to get into Karabakh. If you don't have your boots on the ground, it's very difficult to resolve this conflict. So for Russia, it was very important to have some sort of military presence, like it had in Abkhazia, Ossetia, and Transnistria. So this balance of power started changing by the $5 billion US worth of arms supply that Russia concluded with Azerbaijan. The deal was concluded in it was around 2010. The news about it started creeping out. It wasn't publicly announced. Around 2009-10, and it was by 2016, 85% of all arms imports of Azerbaijan came from Russia. And interestingly, Armenia was sort of under pressure because on one hand, Azerbaijan is arming itself. Armenia was in the process of negotiating the association agreement. And in fact, Armenia was the leader in the talks in terms of the reforms. They were doing really well, way ahead of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. But because of this pressure and this arms race, Armenia was also sort of was feeling the heat from Moscow that the integration will come at a cost. And this was one of the reasons, perhaps, that the Armenian leadership decided to abandon those talks. And 2013, they joined the customs union with Russia. So arms sales through Azerbaijan start about 2010, 11, while Armenia is trying to integrate with the West. Then it drops it with the understanding that once this is done, then they will not, then both Armenia and Artsakh will be protected. It was almost a price that Armenia was paying, with an understanding that then, there's no need to enter the arms race, because by making the strategic alliance, they will be protected. Plus, they will get a discount for energy imports. Nonetheless, lead up to after 2013-14, Armenia is also trying to catch up with its military acquisitions, and it secured a 200 million credit line from Russia to buy weapons. And ironically, between 2013 and 2016, these weapons never arrived. They came only after 2016, the war. Moreover, they arrived only after Armenia agreed to hand over to Russia some element of its air defense. So now looking at Azeri-Russian relationship and strategic cooperation, what's really interesting is how Azerbaijan and Armenia were sort of under the same pressure, but how Armenia, perhaps because of its cultural or historic insecurities, how they were dealing with the same problem so differently. With Armenians, were all both the governments, various governments, and the diaspora, politically organized diaspora, were all perhaps almost emotional and very binary. Either we're with them or we don't exist. Azeris were playing all cards possible, every single card they had in their hands, and they were playing it quite skillfully. When we talk about isolation, this isolation comes in phases. And we were talking about why is it that Armenia agreed to protracted conflict resolution. One argument back then was also that Armenia does not have economy. It doesn't have the economic might to support Artsakh, that to be able to integrate Artsakh or fight for its rights, one has to be very economically strong. But on top of the sort of strategic orientation to Russia, Armenia was doing something else, which later on effectively undermined its all capabilities to build its own armed forces. And that was, Armenia was step by step giving away its economy. Let me see if I can show you some numbers. This is Armenian export destination 2002. You can see that Russia is only the fourth in terms of its importance for Armenian exports. Now, if you want to diversify your economy, you continue on this path, and you continue, breaking away from main markets to potentially those that are more lucrative, and you need diversification. You need less of these big blocks and more of small blocks, because then you become more resilient. And this is what happened. So this is 2002, 2019. That's just diamond. And so your top partner is Russia. See, 2002, you can barely see Russia. Only 3%. See, there has been very steady diversification and very little reliance on the Russian market. And one thing that was happening with the Armenian economy was also the mass exodus of Armenian population, mostly to Russia, and also the infamous debt for assets deal. So during the war, Armenia accumulated. So 2006, the next asset handover takes place, and many experts were saying that this was like selling a cow for price of milk. More specifically, Russia got full control of Hayashen thermal power plant because it took over the fifth block of the power plant. Just want to explain, give a bit of detail about this power plant, because it would have been a critical component for Armenia's energy independence. A year before that, in 2005, Iran's Senior company had agreed with Armenia to make $150 million available for soft loan, whereby they would complete the fifth block construction, and then a further 90 million will be invested in building electricity transmission lines from Armenia Hayashen power plant to Iran. So Armenia would pay in installments for this loan. Annually, from eventually when this cost was covered, and was supposed to be covered within 2-3 years, Armenia would make $100 million in revenues annually from Hayashen 5. And it would have provided 40% of the country's electricity. Like I said, it just was handed over. Now, let's put this in a context. Russia forgave $242 million that Tajikistan owned in exchange for having access to an installation in the mountains that was tracking satellites and missiles. In Kyrgyzstan's case, Kyrgyzstan said that they have difficulties paying $500 million US, and Russia agreed to forgive that debt. 865 million, so that's close to 1 billion, was forgiven to Uzbekistan. Let me see if I have anything. Yes. I thought this is quite interesting. It just shows the arms transfers to Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the light green blue is Russia. 2020, and it comes from CIPRI. CIPRI Arms Transfers Database. So this is where we are, but the economic changes, the military build-up, diplomatic isolation. These were the building blocks to the 2016 war. What's also very interesting in Russian-Azerbaijani relationship is that up until 2010, before all that arms sales began and all of that, if you remember, Azerbaijan was aiming for a policy of independence and non-alignment, and they joined a organization of non-aligned countries. At the same time, they managed to understand the importance of developing their energy sector, not only to boost their economic power, but this was a time when Europe was also looking for non-Russian energy supplies. And Azerbaijan was presenting itself as a big source of alternative oil and gas. Although when you look at the numbers, it's literally around 1% of what Russians were, 1-2% what Russians were exporting to Europe. But it's not that important. It's the narrative that the country presents itself as an alternative, for example, to Russia. At the same time, they were quite balanced in a way that while they built the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline through Turkey, they also built another one to Russia. There's something else that happened that was, I think, also gave strength to Russian-Azeri relationship. I don't know if you remember, there was a lot of discussion about this EU-backed project called Nabucco project. And Nabucco was supposed to bring oil and gas from the Caspian region, bypass Russia, and liberate Europe from Russian energy dependence, hence the name Nabucco. And Azerbaijan was critical in this infrastructure. And although Azerbaijan managed to sort of capitalize on that narrative and present itself as so important in this project, by 2013, they effectively shelved off Nabucco, and they built their own one, which was smaller, only from us transporting Azeri gas to Europe, and thereby not presenting a major threat to Russian energy supplies to Europe. And this was also important in shaping their strategic relationship. So while this is all happening, so Armenia is doing one thing that they thought that they can do, is integrate with Russia as much as they can. The war happens in 2016, and then what we see is that Armenia has lost any bargaining power in Nagorno-Karabakh, talks. It is pretty much isolated, and but there was an effort by then Germany, that was chairing country for OSCE, and the proposal was to prevent future war, which they all saw coming. The idea was to install a security mechanism along all the line of contact. What is this mechanism? Is that you remove your snipers on both sides from the line of contact, and you also install monitors or the mechanism, a monitoring mechanism that will ensure that whoever violates ceasefire is identified, and that there are measures taken to prevent all these violations. That would have meant that Azeris would not have an opportunity to claim that Armenians have staged an attack, as they've always said that Armenia attacked and then we responded. Effectively, starting a new war, a hot war, would have been a lot more difficult. So what happens? After the war, in June, we see that in Vienna, this mechanism is discussed and agreed on. Literally a month after that, in Russia, a new meeting is convened, and Vladimir Putin organizes this meeting with Armenia and Azerbaijan, and it was decided that the security mechanism installation will be shelved off. It was very clear that, it wasn't in obviously Azeri interest or even Russian interest to have this mechanism installed, because there were other plans being developed. Another plan was to change the conflict, to take away the conflict from the Minsk group, from the Western, preclude the Western involvement in this conflict, and bring it into a new format. And the new format will be between Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey, which will be flashed out later on, as we saw. Armenia was under incredible pressure in 2016 and onwards to make these concessions. However, we had also a period where Armenia is entering political turmoil, because for over 2 decades, Armenians put up with corruption and everything on an understanding that we are putting up with all these hardships for as long as Armenian borders and Artsakh are safe. And the narrative that every single government of Armenia that was promoting is that as long as we have this strong partnership with Russians, then we're safe. But in 2016, this informal contract sort of broke down, because clearly everyone could see that the war is coming, a big war is coming. I think this crisis of Armenia's security architecture was one of the reasons why we saw that sort of uprising in 2018 in Armenia. It wasn't about electing current leader of Armenia. In fact, he wasn't really anybody, so to speak, in terms of its political presence. But it was a no vote, and it was a vote of anger against the former government that had failed to provide security. And if I remind you, prior to that, there was Electric Yerevan, because there was also another breach of this contract, because the idea was that Armenia is integrating with Russia to have cheaper gas, but then you don't have it. I mean, you join the custom lock, and then after, I think, 8 or 9 months, the gas prices went up. So when the 2018 event started, interestingly, Russians weren't that concerned to see Serge Sarkisyan go. And one of the reasons is because Serge Sarkisyan also understood that to be able to mitigate some of the risks of the war that was coming, it was to engage the West as much as possible. This is why when the April war happened, Serge Sarkisyan traveled to Germany. He gave a press conference standing next to Merkel, where he said that we have been left alone and that we are fighting with weapons from 1970s. It was an indirect message that, yes, we understand who is behind this and we are left alone. And I think he wasn't forgiven for what he did. He also went on to Bloomberg, where he gave an interview saying that we know what happened in 2016 in April. We know that there were certain countries, we know that at least one Minsk group country knew about this, and we know that certain countries wanted to bring in their peacekeeping forces, but we don't want those peacekeeping forces. I think this was the most thinly veiled remarks that in a way he wasn't forgiven for. So him being removed from power was not necessarily that bad for Russians and for Azerbaijan, of course. So what we're seeing in 2018 is the status quo around Artsakh is collapsing. But unfortunately, we're also seeing that the Armenian elite and Armenian diaspora, politically organized diaspora, is unable to comprehend how the status quo is collapsing and what can be done. So what we also think is that there are opportunities. And one big opportunity was given to the Armenian elite by the Armenian people in 2018. Like I said, it's my deep conviction that it wasn't Pashinyan or his utterly unknown group of people who came to, who people wanted to see in power. People wanted to get the old regime change, and they wanted to have their voices heard. And most importantly, it was a channel of communication that they were opening with the West through, giving Armenia democratic credentials, and perhaps giving an opportunity for those in the diaspora and in Armenia to come together and understand that the country was in deep crisis. Any revolution is a crisis. It means that your institutions are not working. So although it was bloodless, but it was still a crisis. Now, what does our elite do, knowing that the war is coming? Instead of consolidating their efforts, we're seeing that especially in Armenia, we're seeing sort of a unleashing of hybrid war. And what is this hybrid war? Is the info wars. One is accusing another of being a traitor, and all the while everyone is trying to force the other one to give even a bigger allegiance to Russia. And this is where you see this narrative of, the Sorosites have come to power, although there is absolutely no evidence that there was any engagement of the West with these people. So a precious time that Armenia had to rearm itself, to prepare, and to also break out of diplomatic isolation, that was wasted. We talked a lot about the old regimes, but I want to say that what this current government has done, everything prior to that sort of pales, because they had all the cards in their hands. They had the opportunity given by Armenian people to break away from the diplomatic isolation. Nothing has been done to develop even remotely comprehensible strategy towards engagement with the West. The current government's engagement boiled down to asking for financial assistance from European Union or from the US. There has been nothing of substance that they had presented to the West. There has been nothing of substance to start discussing what this new Armenia can do in the regional context as an independent player. Moreover, everything, almost a competition started between this government and the previous regime to prove their love and devotion to Russia. When Serge Sarkisian didn't even send troops to Syria, the current government did. But it was too late because, and this was a biggest miscalculation, the war machine was already afoot and it was going to happen. And Armenia's deliberate, and the diaspora's in fact, decision not to do anything to expose that this Lavrov plan was being materialized, it was just a gift to Azeris. And I think it is sad to see that even during the war, even to the lead up of the war, if you remember the July 2020 events, when there were all the hallmarks that a very large-scale war is happening, there was an absolute disengagement of the current government with the West. And they knew that at least, two members of Minsk group are represented by the West. But this, to me, was an absolute fine example of Armenian political identity, so to speak, if there is one, and Armenia's strategy, which has always been, and after the declaration of independence, has exclusively been Russia-centered. It's an architecture that is exclusively based on Russia. But it is based on assumption that always Armenian and Russian interests will overlap. It does not have plan B when these interests do not overlap. And in fact, our history has shown that very often they do not overlap. Even during the war, when Armenians now complained that there was not much international outcry about that war, no single Armenian leader or community leaders or diaspora lobbying organizations came out and spoke about Lavrov plan. No one has done it. There has been, despite Armenia's dire situation, no one stood up and said who actually was behind this. Why is it that a war lasts for 44 days and Russia's strategic partners are not responding. What is it that, what was that stopped Azeris going into Stepanakert? Why would Azeris so eagerly bring in Russian troops when everyone else, look at other former Soviet states, they're all trying to get rid of those troops? How come this war was portrayed as if Azeris and Turks are fighting against, they're trying to contain Russia and fighting against Russia's allies. But all of a sudden, as a result of this war, it's actually the Russians who arrived and whose influence in the region has increased immensely. These are points that every single Armenian political organization and Armenian embassies should have alarmed and spoke about, but there has been silence. So when Armenians are complaining that there was silence from non-Armenians and, so to speak, the international community, somehow they forget that they were also very much silent.